This series is supported by Benefit Street Partners.
Benefit Street Partners is a leading global alternative credit asset manager offering clients investment solutions across a broad range of complementary credit strategies, including direct lending, special situations, structured credit, high-yield bonds, leveraged loans, and commercial real estate debt and equity. This episode is also supported by PIMCO, a global leader in active fixed income with deep expertise across public and private markets. PIMCO invests their clients' capital in income and credit opportunities that span the liquidity spectrum, leveraging their decades of expertise navigating complex debt markets.
When I was in the US Army, it's not like you see in the movies where you just immediately start shooting guns and throwing grenades, things like that. They start in a very systematic, very procedurally oriented crawl, walk, run methodology. So when you first go to the shooting range, you don't even bring a rifle. You just learn where the shooting range is. You learn how to get into the shooting hole. You learn where the targets are. And in the investing world as well, from an allocator's perspective, maybe instead of doing direct investments on our own, we first do co-investments with private equity venture capital firms with which we have great relationships and which we think there are interesting opportunities. So we're still following that kind of crawl, walk, run methodology before we start putting really large amounts of capital to work. We're demonstrating competency at each level in the progression and that we're growing individually as professionals, our understanding of how to do this.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Alex Ambroz, who is Chief Executive Officer at the Allocator Training Institute and Allocator Jobs. He was formerly Chief Investment Officer at Aberdeen Investments Ireland, before which he held a series of allocator roles, mainly in the US. He's a US military veteran. Welcome, Alex. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'd love to talk a little bit about your background and entry into the field, and in particular, your stint in the military. And I'd love to know how that influenced and formed you as a professional.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in America in the Northeast. I grew up in foster care, so bounced around to a lot of different homes, lived with a lot of different families. Thankfully, the experience, especially at the end of my time in foster care in America, was a very positive one. So I'm very grateful for that. And then ended up in the US Army because I didn't have any family or money to pay for college. And in America, joining the military helps you pay for school. And in the military, I joined the infantry. And in the infantry, I drove a Bradley fighting vehicle, was deployed to a couple places, and just had an all-around really powerful, impactful experience on me personally and professionally. One of the most important things professionally that I would say that was imparted to me by my senior leaders was very, very high expectations. Growing up in foster care, you don't really have a lot of stability in your life. So you don't have a lot of people that are thinking about where you're going next in your life, in your career, or anything. They're just focused on stabilizing where you are today. In the military, focused on excellence in the mission that we're trying to accomplish, and also excellence in the people that work with, for you, and around you. And so that expectation from my leaders from day one of achieving nothing but the absolute best in terms of my effort and the outcome of what I was doing was something brand new to me. And it really woke up inside me what I was capable of, what other people were capable of around me. And also, importantly as well, something in the military that's ingrained in you from day one is being very comfortable with being wrong and noticing other people are wrong and helping them fix it. Not because you don't like them, not because you think they're bad people, but because you're trying to improve them as a military professional, as a soldier, as an infantryman, which is what I was doing. And then I got out of the Army and I was able to go to the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in Amherst, Massachusetts. And the fun, quick little story I'll tell you is I was a senior sitting in school, and an alumni of the University of Massachusetts came through, a guy named Dennis Miner, who was a co-founder at Morgan Creek Capital Management, an outsourced CIO firm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, very far away. Morgan Creek Capital Management was one of the first spinouts from a university endowment to create an OCIO over 20 years ago. And Dennis came through one day, unexpected, no one knew he was coming. And he came by with a career services person, needed some help setting up the presentation, needed some help getting people to the presentation, but they didn't take any resumes. And we were all very frustrated. You came and gave a presentation, you said you were hiring, but you didn't take resumes. And then I got a call 2 weeks later, and they wanted to have an interview, eventually got the job at Morgan Creek Capital Management. That was the start of my career. But the best part is, I asked Dennis, who brought me down, who spoke for me, brought me down as a new analyst at Morgan Creek Capital Management from Amherst, Massachusetts down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where everyone else was a UNC Chapel Hill alum. And I asked him a couple of years after working there, hey, Dennis, I really appreciate working here. I've learned a lot. How'd you get my resume? I never sent you my resume. And Dennis said, Well, I asked the career services people to send us the resume of the top 10 students at the Eisenberg School of Management. And I said, yes, well, of course, I was a top 10 student. And Dennis said, no, you weren't anywhere close to that. And I said, oh, yeah, that's probably true. And I asked him, well, how'd you get my resume? And he said, well, one person dropped out. They invited 10 people from UMass Amherst to come interview for that one job. And he said, out of the 10, one person dropped out. And Dennis called the Career Center and said, what about that kid who helped us set up the presentation, just unprompted, not planned, and who helped get everyone in the room? And that's what got me to interview. That's what eventually started the roll down to getting that job. So I'm very grateful that I was ready for the interview. I was prepared for it from the school and from my time in the military. But I'm also grateful for the luck of just being there, being noticed, having an opportunity to raise my hand.
Well, what a beautiful story. And thank you for sharing that. I think it is also a reminder from the beginning of that story of the importance of our networks, how family can crop up in places we least expect, whether that's the military, whether that's a community, a college, a careers office, or a career. So I think a really important reminder you've given us there. And equally, the initiative you showed, it reminds me of an email I sent my daughter yesterday, which was, she will soon be a graduate. And it talked about the skills you will need in the presence of AI. And one of them was taking initiative, leading projects, strong work ethic. And I think you probably demonstrated all three of those to the Morgan Creek team at setting up their presentation.
Yeah, small thing, but every bit helps. Every bit helps.
And then fast forward then, so Morgan Creek, clearly a fantastic institutional endowment-led multi-strategy with also a lot of alternatives in there. How then did you end up in Dublin and in your current role in allocator training?
Yeah, so long story short, had a great experience at Morgan Creek Capital Management, just a great team led by Mark Yusko, the CIO and CEO there. Went to Duke for business school, and then I was at JP Morgan for about 6 years, had a great experience. And then I was at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation working in their investment office with the CIO, Stefan Strine. Had a great experience there, absolutely loved it. Ohio is a wonderful place to live and to raise a family. But then I found out, now remember, I grew up in foster care, and so I really didn't know my family history at all. And a few years ago, I discovered that my mother's side of the family was Irish. So after a little bit of work, I was able to gather all the documents, get an Irish passport, which was very interesting and very cool, but just kind of sat in a drawer. And then my wife, she's a scientist working at Pfizer. And she'd been traveling all over the world working with Pfizer and been going back and forth from Cleveland to Dublin quite a bit. And the folks in Dublin offered her a new career opportunity. But here was the kicker. This would be a wonderful career opportunity for my wife professionally. Personally and logistically, it would be very straightforward since I had an Irish passport. We could just come to Dublin. But for me professionally, it was very scary because I had a great role working on a great team at the Cleveland Clinic. But that role was not portable. I could not work 100% remote, especially from a different country. So when I first came to Dublin, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I told my wife I had this idea for a training program for investment professionals that I thought would be really helpful. But seeing as we were still new to the country and still settling in, she told me to find a job. So thankfully, the folks at Aberdeen Investments, Aberdeen is a $500 billion investment firm based out of the UK with offices all around Europe and around the world. And they were looking for a chief investment officer here in Dublin, a role that was perfect for my experience and for my interests. And the team here in Dublin at Aberdeen was great, and I loved working with them. But after a couple of years, I still had in my heart this desire to start this training program for investment professionals. So with the permission of Mrs. Ambroz, I was able to say a heartfelt goodbye to my friends at Aberdeen and then start the Allocator Training Institute.
Well, I'd love to learn a little bit about how you approach then training allocators. Does that come from a set of core beliefs that you have, skills, approaches? And what is on your mind today as you seek to train? What are the skills that these allocators need to learn?
Yeah, it's a great question. The real key that we think of and that I think of coming up in the industry, and I remember being a young analyst working at Morgan Creek, and they asked me to do some quantitative work that I hadn't been taught. And in undergrad and in graduate school, I studied finance with a specific focus on investment finance. But finance in most schools today in America still focuses appropriately on securities analysis and every flavor of securities analysis, from accounting to financial statement analysis to CAPM. A lot of it's focused just on evaluating securities and portfolios of securities. And so this world of allocators focuses on funds, evaluating a portfolio constructed of funds. So when we put together this training program, myself, the team, and the advisory board, the key was focus on how to actually do the job. So we focus on two key pillars, practicality and utility. So as an example, teach the concepts, and we expect competency in those concepts, but we don't need people to memorize formulas because that's not how the world works. It's 3 levels. And we think of the three levels in the program similar to a career progression. In the beginning of your career, you're doing a lot of calculating. You're calculating a lot of things and pushing the answers to different people and places. In the middle of your career, you're providing opinions. You're writing investment memos. You're opining about what's happening in the markets, and you're making suggestions about what to do in the market. When you're at a senior level in your career, director, managing director, CIO, CEO, you're deciding, and you're responsible for the outcome of those decisions. So a good example of this I would give you is private asset cash flow pacing models. It's a pretty sophisticated topic. It's not PhD level math-wise, but the concepts included in how to manage the expectations of how much to commit to private assets in a multi-asset class portfolio, including the incorporation of the capital market assumptions used for the public and private parts of the portfolio, spending policy needs for an institution, expectations of donations if it's an endowment especially. These are concepts that for almost any allocator are intuitive because they've been living with it their whole career. But this concept is not taught anywhere. There's no undergraduate program. There's no class on YouTube. You can ask AI about the Takahashi Alexander paper that was written in 2001, but they'll come at it from a blank slate. So the key is that we want to teach these concepts. We want to teach them thoroughly. And then we pair it uniquely with case studies of how the real world actually works. So here's an example of a case study of liability-driven investing and the movement for a pension plan, for example, from 85% funded status to 95% funded status with an injection of cash from corporate. That's very academic. It's a little quantitative. It's not that difficult conceptually to teach. But then the other piece of the puzzle that we teach, because this is the way the world actually works, is the actual political discussion that will take place when you walk into the CFO's office and ask for cash from the corporate balance sheet that will go into a pension plan from which the corporation can no longer pull that cash. And that's not academic, that's political. And so we want to teach not just the concepts that younger allocators need to know for their career, but also give them case studies of how this actually works in the real world so that they're prepared, not just academically, but also emotionally.
I love that. Absolutely fascinating. That human side, which is actually never taught anywhere. I think we all know that most academic courses do not cover the practicalities, but that power of persuasion. I think we may hear about negotiation skills, but it's not a kind of an evenly balanced negotiation skills. And I suppose then there's also the next step, which might be self-evaluation too, and self-efficacy reviews. And then just in terms of some of the strategies that you look at and that excite you today, maybe that you're adding to your roster, you have participated in another podcast where you spoke about the Ferrari effect and fake alpha. And I'll put a link to that podcast in the show notes. But can you tell us what that means and what is some of the fake alpha that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, there's two key concepts there. I'll go through both of them. I'll start with the Ferrari test because it's a fun one. And it's something that we always teach. So I learned it myself. I learned it at, in all due respect, I learned it at the feet of Mark Yusko at Morgan Creek Capital Management, who was a huge influence on my career. And one of the things he showed us, and we saw in time, especially in the mid-2000s, with a lot of the hedge fund blowups that happened, these stories kept coming out publicly, which were previously only known privately, which is that when a young hedge fund, a young private equity fund, a young investment firm starts to invest, they are hugely incentivized to find alpha, to grow the firm, to grow the team, to find new opportunities to invest, to ensure that where they're investing is the best place for the capital they're investing for their strategy. There's an enormous amount of incentives to work and to find alpha. But over time, some, not all, some investment managers, instead of receiving 10Ks, they start receiving brochures about Ferraris and Lamborghinis and boats and ski places you can go to in Switzerland. And so the desire switches from finding alpha to finding comfort, because instead of worrying about how much you're going to make in incentive compensation, they're focused on how large the ongoing, almost subscription-like revenue they're getting just from the management compensation. And when that happens, I've seen this. I've walked into offices and you look outside and you see like, oh, that's a really nice car. Is that your Lamborghini? Wow. I've seen this. So if someone has a BMW or a Mercedes, okay. Sometimes they might have a Honda outside to show that they're a value investor. And I'm always curious. I always ask them when they say like they have a Honda or a Toyota or a minivan outside, I always ask them and the answer is always different. Do you have any other cars? Is that your only car? So that's the Ferrari test. On the fake alpha side, this is something that has been around forever, I think will be around forever, but is not fully appreciated by every generation of investors, which is alpha outside of factor exposures. So we all learn CAPM in undergraduate finance, or you come across it if you start in the investing career. And CAPM is the start, beta, the beta to the market risk premium, plus the risk-free rate. Okay, great. Here's the beta that we've got. So this is our first factor. And a lot of times in my entire career, when I see a performance or a risk report, beta is always listed, always. For a fund, for a sub-asset class, for an asset class, for the portfolio, what's the beta? And then maybe we'll tell you what the benchmark is that we're using for that beta. But CAPM is just the start. When Fama French came up with the three-factor model and then the five-factor model, CAPM is still an embedded important piece of that. But most investors never move beyond beta, CAPM beta, to think about the impact that other factors are having on their performance. And so one thing we did, started doing this at Morgan Creek a little bit, expanded upon it when I was at JP Morgan. And then at the Cleveland Clinic, I was very lucky professionally to work with a great group of folks where we could operationalize this process of assessing factor exposures from managers, from asset classes, from everything on a consistent and straightforward basis. A key thing I discovered in my career is that senior leaders don't care whether the calculations and the process that you're doing to get to these numbers takes 6 days or 6 hours or 6 minutes. They only care about what the number means. They don't care about the what, they care about the so what. And so the ability when we were at the Cleveland Clinic to operationalize that process gave us that lens to quickly and easily and systematically see on a regular basis what is the actual alpha of the manager, what are the factor exposures. And what we saw kind of spanned the spectrum in a couple of different ways. The first way, this might be a macro manager where we can't really tell. The factors are so inconsistent that they're doing something really dynamic, but they're uncorrelated to the rest of the portfolio, so we want to keep them. The second type of manager, they have consistent factor exposures, or maybe they dynamically adjust a bit, but we can't replicate those factors. It's just too sophisticated. It's beyond our capabilities as an investment office that invests in managers. But the third type, very rare, but they do exist and they like to hide, are beta managers charging alpha fees. So this is a manager. The simplest version would be a manager with a beta of 1 to the S&P 500 charging you 2 and 20. That's easy. Well, obviously we should not have that type of manager. But the manager that has simple and consistent factor exposures that could be easily replicated, or this has happened in my career as well, they have consistent factor exposures to the wrong benchmark. So they tell you they're a US small cap equity manager and they're beating the US small cap equity benchmark, but they don't have any beta to that benchmark because they're not investing in small cap equity anymore. Now they're investing in mid cap equity where they're not beating the benchmark and where their factor exposure is nearly 1. So I've seen that, but only because we had built a process and a philosophy around evaluating not just the absolute returns of each manager, which is important and everyone wants to talk about it, and not just the relative returns of the manager to a benchmark, also important, also useful, but the alpha outside of the factor exposures. And doing that once can be difficult the first time you do it. Building a systematic operationalized process to have that as part of your regular discussions of how the manager is doing, that took us a couple of years to build, but it's incredibly useful to understand these managers are adding real alpha and these managers are charging us alpha fees for beta outcomes.
We're going to hear from one of the sponsors of this series, Benefit Street Partners, BSP. I sat down with Rich Byrne, President and CEO of BSP, and asked him about what his leadership style was.
My leadership advice is to lead by example. Nobody wants to follow somebody that, the general that says, oh, go take the hill. And I'll be back here, in my little hut. Good luck to you guys. You generally will give your all for that general that gets on their horse or whatever kind of battle you're in and rides up front, along with the rank and file troops. And I think the same applies in work. It's like you should have the same ethos, the same work ethic.
And now back to the show. Well, that is fascinating as a deep dive. And I'd say also clearly alpha is dynamic and changes, and the ability to distinguish the two, but also to see where it persists. And I'm going to pick up on something you said about sharing the idea that kind of the conclusion or the kind of the action item with the superior, because that's another aspect that is kind of, I suppose, getting to this AI replacement question, which keeps coming up. In a way, yes, AI is shortening the processing time or the research time. But that's not really the point, as you said. It certainly is the point for someone's lifestyle and someone's, I suppose, quality of life. But the point is the conclusion from that. And one of my fears is around data deluge and basically the fact that we now have access to even more data, but what we know what to do with it. I think that is an important thing. One of the other obsessions I have is around risk-taking skill sets. And I think you mentioned the erosion of alpha and how it becomes beta because you lose the impetus to take risk at the manager level. How do you cater for that at an allocator level? How do you, teach risk-taking and teach then, maintaining that muscle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd bring back an analogy from our military days. So when I was in the US Army, it's not like you see in the movies where you just immediately start shooting guns and throwing grenades, things like that. They start in a very systematic, very procedurally oriented crawl, walk, run methodology. So when you first go to the shooting range, you don't even bring a rifle. You just learn where the shooting range is. You learn how to get into the shooting hole. You learn where the targets are. You hold your hands. You don't even have a rifle. And then the next day you go back, and this time they give you what's called a rubber ducky. So the rubber ducky looks like a rifle, but it's made out of rubber, has the same weight. You have to carry it like a real rifle. You go back to the range. It's very structured of everything you're going to do. And the drill sergeants, the drill instructors, the range masters, they are all watching to see that everyone treats and respects the rubber ducky as if it were a real rifle. And they're trying to catch anyone who lifts their rifle, which is incredibly dangerous. You never point your rifle at anyone, any person ever. It should always be pointed at the ground. So they're checking for all these small things. They're correcting it as it happens. They're pointing out to everyone when a correction is happening so that we're all learning. The next day you go back and you have a real rifle, but you don't have any rounds. The next day you go back, you have a real rifle with blanks. And then finally, after a couple of weeks of this, you go to the range and they give you a real rifle, you're carrying it, and you have 3 bullets to get used to shooting it. And then you go back, and eventually, after several weeks of this, you get a 30-round magazine to really try and shoot all the targets. So in most movies, they skip right to the end, where, oh, you're shooting at the rifle range, you have endless bullets. That's not how it really works. And in the investing world as well, from an allocator's perspective, this is where I saw success of helping younger allocators start to build that risk-seeking budget appropriately, appropriate for the institution itself, and appropriate for the growth and development of a younger allocator. And that is, as an example, if you want to start a direct investing program, something a lot of allocators are interested in, but it's a little scary because it's not commonly found, of great, let's first build the philosophy of how we would do it. Let's go talk to other allocators to see how they are doing it. Let's start by evaluating potential investment opportunities. Maybe instead of doing direct investments on our own, we first do co-investments with private equity venture capital firms with which we have great relationships and which we think there are interesting opportunities. So we're still following that kind of crawl, walk, run methodology before we start putting really large amounts of capital to work. We're demonstrating competency at each level in the progression, and that we're growing individually as professionals, our understanding of how to do this, as well as the investment office and other senior leaders that are part of the institution building their own comfort that we know what we're doing here at each step of the way.
That is a really fascinating focus. I'm just thinking about the curriculum you just laid out here. It really is quite a heavy behavioral component, a skill building that is not that which we can simply access on our databases or our AI tools at the moment, which is, I think, something that is actually quite lacking given how much time I spend with allocators. My last question on the allocation side is around, say, emerging strategies or even some of the impact related strategies. How much do you see that allocators have that as, and sometimes it's one and the same, it's a desire to both, achieve impact through emerging strategies or minority strategies. Do you see that as a strand through what the modern allocator is looking to do?
Absolutely. But there's this bifurcation, though, between the desire to invest in impact investing focus outcomes and emerging managers, for example. The reason there's a bifurcation is that a lot of these allocators, especially the larger ones that have a large enough investment team and a program to consider these types of strategies, they might be writing checks in each of their managers for $50, $75, $100 million in order for it to have a meaningful impact on the performance outcome of the institution itself. But how do you write a check for $50 million to an emerging manager that has $25 million in total assets? That's why they're emerging. They're not emerged. And again, as well, for an impact investment focused outcome, you may be looking for just a return of capital, not necessarily a return on capital. But how do you make sure that you have a return of capital? If you're writing a $1 to $20 million check, which is much lower size than you're used to writing, and you have to spend as much time underwriting that, and how do you justify to the investment team, to the investment committee, to the CEO, that that time is worth spending relative to what else the institution could be doing at a much larger check size and a potentially much larger impact size if it provides a positive return to the portfolio and therefore the institution? So there's one idea that I've come across, which I think is a really interesting way to do this, especially for emerging managers. And I want to give full credit to Mike Naguisi of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, from whom I am fully stealing this idea, but I think it should be shared more broadly. So his idea, which I'm sharing with you, is that allocators could, as an example, initiate an emerging managers program as a bake-off. So if you've ever seen the Great British Baking Show, or my kids love to watch Is It Cake, which is the greatest show on Netflix, there's always a bake-off amongst really highly qualified applicants. And what you could do, for example, with emerging managers is say, okay, normally our ticket size as an allocator is, say, 30 million. But because of the size of each of these emerging managers, we would overwhelm them. So we can't give any one of them 30 million, but we could give 3 of them 10 million each. And we could have a structured program that they know from day one, this is a 3-year investment. And over those 3 years, we as an LP investor are going to be investing not just this 10 million into each of you, but also into supporting your build out of your infrastructure and your team and sharing your story with other allocators, with the idea very explicit from day one that after 3 years, watching the growth of these 3 individual emerging managers, we will, at the end of 3 years, consolidate that initial $10 million investment in from each of these 3, assuming it's still approximately 30 million at the end. We will then consolidate that to 1. So it's going to be a bake-off, and everyone knows who the competitors are and what the goals are at the end of those 3 years. So that's a way to start an emerging manager program, support smaller managers, but also acknowledge the infrastructure issues of just doing that with one manager when the individual check might not make enough of an impact. But again, I stole the idea from someone much smarter than I, but I think it should be shared more broadly with other allocators.
Well, a fascinating idea. And I think it's a bit like the farm team, but yet seems to be more intentional about making managers know exactly, starting from the outset, knowing it is a competition. And it reminds me also of a similar type of a Shark Tank scenario that used to occur in the Chicago Teachers Pension Plan. And Angela Miller-May, formerly CIO there, has been on this podcast twice. And they would have the first Friday presentations whereby the emerging managers would come get a slot on first Friday. The board members generously gave their time they're very invested in this program, the Emerging Managers Program. They would present for 20 minutes and get feedback. So the important thing was there was maybe a slim chance of them getting an allocation, certainly based on an initial presentation, but it was practice, it was feedback, and it was invaluable for that reason. And it got them at hearings. So lots of great ideas there. Well, we are coming up on time, and it's been a fantastic conversation just about this whole. We'd have to dedicate a few more podcasts to the allocator training concept. But just for this one, to conclude with some closing questions, you mentioned your journey to investing and ups and downs. Would you say there was any particular lesson learned in that time frame that you really internalized and learned lessons from?
Yeah, I'll tell you one quick story. About 20 years ago, I was tasked as an analyst to implement a CRM system. And so I looked around, and Salesforce was at the time one of the best. I got permission to implement it, get the whole team on it, and it failed miserably after spending tens of thousands of dollars on a consultant. And I couldn't figure out why. This was the best system, arguably. We spent tens of thousands to get it perfect, but nobody used it. Why not? And I realized 2 things. Number 1, I didn't get buy-in from the stakeholders involved in the outcome of the decision. And number 2, I tried to change a process. And that I've discovered for corporations large and small is one of the most difficult things you could ever try to do. So from that, I learned, number 1, even if you disagree with the process, you still must respect it. You still must understand it, acknowledge it, and understand that changing a process can be one of the hardest things in any corporation. Even if the new process might be better, faster, cheaper, anything, it can still be incredibly difficult. But most importantly, I learned on the second side of that to get buy-in from all stakeholders, everyone involved, from the CEO to the admin, to the analysts, to the managing directors, everyone. Understand what they're really looking for and ensure their buy-in so that when you ask them to raise their hands to support whatever it is you're pushing forward, you've already had individual conversations. You've already understood their concerns, their desires, their needs, their anything. And having not done that is why I failed so miserably when I first tried to do that. So it was a fascinating experience. I'm just glad they didn't fire me when it happened.
Well, thanks you for your candor and owning up to that. But actually, I think that is something that goes on far more often than we think. And we only have to look, I've spoken a lot in this podcast about AI tools, but I think, at best, many institutions are tinkering with Copilot and are really only scratching the surface of many tools. Maybe that's a fear of change, a fear of the unknown. I think a lot of it is lack of buy-in, resistance to change. And equally, a lot of dollars, I'm sure, and pounds and euros are being squandered on these expensive systems and consultants without the proper process of change being taken into account. So great call out there. My last question is around any words of wisdom. You've already mentioned some of the many people who are influential in your life, and that's usually one of our areas here too. But moving to words of wisdom or creed or motto, is there anything you can leave us with here?
My personal motto in life it's a Latin phrase, contra fatum, means against fate. So there's a much more common phrase, amor fati, which means to love your fate. It's been around for thousands of years, and just to acknowledge and respect your fate. But my belief in life is that even if large parts of your story may be written, from where you're born, how you're born, who your family is, that there's always still an opportunity to move in the direction of where you want your life, your career, everything, where you want it to go. But the only way to do that is to push back against fate. So I take contra fatum, that Latin phrase, as my personal motto. The one big thing I've learned in life professionally is the importance of your network and finding people, especially, and this is difficult and very humbling, but being comfortable in your ignorance, reveling in your ignorance by reaching out and asking questions, not being afraid to say, I don't know about this. Can you teach me? What do you think about this? Even if you have an opinion about it. So as an example, Kelly Washington from the Cleveland Clinic, Stefan Strine from the same place, Monica Issar from JP Morgan, Mark Yusko from Morgan Creek, so many senior leaders in my career, them among many others, have taught me so much. And in large part because they've been willing to teach, and also because I was, humble enough to just ask them, like, hey, I don't know about this topic. Can you teach me? And then staying in touch with them and being comfortable reaching out, all the time. So one thing I do, I recommend everyone do it. I send out 2 emails a year, just providing a mid-year and an end-of-year update to everyone I know. Just, hey, here's the family. Here how the kids are doing. Here's some interesting places we've traveled. Here's what's going on with work. Just a way to maintain your network. But that, I found, has been one of the most valuable parts of my career. Thankfully, having a good network at the start and the support of them, but also being comfortable enough to ask them all the time questions, ask them to teach me.
Well, what a thoughtful way to conclude this discussion. And again, also what a list of who's who in the list of illustrious asset managers and asset allocators. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your very human approach to asset allocation, to investing, your reflections, and overall your insights with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Places podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.